Our priority will be Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American-owned small businesses, women-owned businesses. And finally, having equal access to resources needed to reopen and rebuild. But we're going to make a concerted effort to help small businesses in low-income communities, in big cities, small towns, rural communities that have faced systemic barriers to relief.
Systemic barriers to relief. There was no identitarian prequel for the payroll protection program, as I recall. But more to the point, the idea that equity will be front and center with respect to reopening our economy, with respect to COVID relief, just as equity has been front and center in some states and cities with respect to vaccine distribution. And how has that performed? Has that enhanced the distribution of vaccines so that, particularly as you go up the age demographics, as many people get vaccinated as quickly as possible to protect those who are the most vulnerable? I asked that against the backdrop of 27 million doses of vaccines having been distributed and only 9 million doses of vaccines having been deployed. And now we're going to take that same approach to economic growth. For a reaction to this and a more global discussion about what America's economy may look like in 2021 and beyond as a result of some of the decisions that have been made in 2020 into 21. Pleased to be joined by James Rickards. He's the editor of Strategic Intelligence, New York Times bestselling author of The New Great Depression, Winners and Losers in a Post-Pandemic World. James Rickards, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be with you.
Good to have you here. And you are not as sanguine as many, to put it lightly, in terms of how the economy will snap back against the backdrop of the lockdown policies and other pandemic responses that have been affected from last March to present, and frankly, at least based on what those in charge are saying, will continue to be the policies at least for the next several months.
That's right, Dan. I tell people I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. I'm a realist and an analyst. So I base it on data, I base it on good models. And when you look at it, Wall Street and the White House, go back to last spring, they were, we'll have a V-shaped recovery. The economy will go down sharply, but we'll come back sharply, and we're going to have pent-up demand, and that's going to get the economy back on its feet. As soon as I heard pent-up demand, I thought back to 2009. Remember green shoots, everything with green shoots, the economy was going to come back. All we got at the time were brown weeds. We never got that kind of growth. We had an expansion, a long one, but it was the weakest in American history. Same thing here. So first of all, let's go back to the lockdown, last spring. My wife and I usually go out to dinner on a Friday night. We quarantine and lockdown just like everybody else in March, April, and May. So finally by June, the restaurants were opening up. We went out to dinner. I didn't order 9 dinners. I ordered one like I usually do. In other words, those 9 dinners I was locked down and didn't go out. That was permanently lost. There was no pent-up demand for 9 dinners. I just had one. Same thing across the economy as a whole, number one. Number two, a lot of businesses didn't reopen. They went bankrupt. If you had 20 employees, they said, well, you lay them all off and you'll hire back 10. Well, not if you don't reopen. And hundreds of thousands, if not millions of businesses did not reopen. They never survived. Now, where are we now? The pandemic right now, in terms of caseload and fatalities, it's 10 times worse than it was last spring. That's the data from the Johns Hopkins coronavirus dashboard. Again, I don't make these things up. You can actually look at it. 10 times worse in terms of caseload and fatalities. What are the governors doing? They're locking down again. And by the way, lockdowns don't work. And there's very good science behind that. That's not speculation or opinion. We have the data now because this has lasted for a year. They go around the world. They look at every country in the world. There were extreme lockdowns in places like Korea. There were mild lockdowns in places like Sweden. And some places didn't lock down at all. South Dakota is a good example. They never locked down. They just made it a voluntary thing. But the data shows that the caseload and fatalities were the same regardless of your lockdown policy, which means lockdowns don't work. They're not an explanatory variable. They don't stop the spread of the virus. They're very good at destroying the economy. They do that. And the politicians just need to be seen to be doing something. So they go, lock it down. It doesn't stop the spread of the virus. We see that today. We've been locking down on and off for a year, and the virus is 10 times worse than it was a year ago. So, explain to me how lockdowns work. The answer is they don't.
Just on that score, there was effectively an admission of that by Andrew Cuomo, not formally but implicitly, in his State of the State address, where he said, despite the fact you described where the caseloads are, case fatalities are, that we can't stay locked down forever. We can't wait till vaccinations reach critical mass. We have to reopen our economy. That's Andrew Cuomo, of all people.
There's nothing left to reopen,
Yeah.
he tweeted.
Well, first of all, he's right about that, and the reason is he destroyed it. It was all of his lockdowns in the past year have destroyed small business. Approximately 1 million people have left New York City. The population is 8 million, so you're talking about 12% of the population got up and left. And again, we have the data on this. When people move, they file a change of address notice with the post office, and it's a publicly available information. And there were 300,000 notices were filed through October, more since then, but just take the hard data from October. But if that's households, but if there's on average three people per household, could be more or less individual cases. That's 1 million people, almost 1 million people, and the number's higher. So cities are the greatest wealth generating mechanisms, agglomerations in the history of civilization. When you depopulate cities, you destroy wealth creation. That's exactly what's going on. Some of it's the riots, some of it's high taxes, but a lot of it's these lockdowns. I mean, these businesses can't survive. A restaurant, a bar, a nail salon, a gas station, a boutique, they don't have $5 million of working capital. They have revenue, they pay their expenses, and they make a little profit, but they can't survive, and they haven't. So Cuomo, he talks a good game, but by the way, New York is heavily locked down, so he may talk about it, but that's just political posturing. He doesn't know what he's doing, and it would be one thing if it worked. I mean, that you might not want to bear that cost, even if it did work. But what's worse is that it doesn't work. Lockdowns are killing more people than they're saving. Suicide rates have tripled, murder rates have doubled, alcohol abuse up, drug abuse up, domestic violence up, depression, anxiety. They're all on the increase. And by the way, when you look at the riots last summer and then the riot on Capitol Hill last week, take the politics out of it. I understand everyone's got a political cause or whatever, but a lot of that and more to come, I would say, are being triggered by people being locked up and quarantined for no good reason, jobs being destroyed, and that just builds up the anger. So it's expressing itself in these political movements, but it's part of the pandemic response.
And Governor Cuomo, now he's thinking about turning empty office buildings and hotels into apartments. Who's going to move to New York? Because once there's another pandemic, he's going to shut it all down again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And commercial real estate has far to fall. So let's say you had an office building in Midtown Manhattan or Chicago or down any downtown area, and you had 10 floors for a big company. Well, no one would have voluntarily gone to work from home, but they had to do it because of the pandemic. Turns out it works pretty well. People like it. Companies are like, yeah, this works for us. So they're not going to go back to 10 floors. They might keep 2 floors, with office space that can be shared in a locker room, not like a high school locker room, but an attractive facility. You show up for 2 days every other week and meet your clients, and then work from home the rest of the time. Well, all right, so right away you're crushing the landlord because you're taking 2 floors instead of 10. What about the food trucks, the restaurants, the lunchtime shopping, the public transportation, all the stuff that comes from having large number of people concentrate? That's all gone. That's down 50%, 80%, and that's showing up in the data. And then people go, oh, well, the stock market's at an all-time high. My 401k is back. That's true, but the S&P 500, which is the main benchmark, is cap weighted, meaning your market capitalization that's how much you affect the index. It's down to 7 stocks. And we know what they are. It's Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Netflix, Microsoft, and Tesla. Those 7 stocks are 40% of the index. They are the least affected by the pandemic, and yes, they are going up, but they're leaving everyone else behind. So the other 493 in the S&P are flat to down, and that ignores the fact that half the economy is small and medium-sized business. Your local restaurant's not on the New York Stock Exchange. 50% of jobs and 45% of GDP are small and medium-sized businesses, and that's what's getting crushed by the lockdowns, which don't work. So we're destroying the economy for no good reason.
And the book is The New Great Depression, Winners and Losers in a Post-Pandemic World. Well, you've just described who the winners are, and you've described sort of in general terms who some of the losers are, and I think when the water recedes, maybe in the spring and summer, and people don't recognize what downtown Chicago or New York or San Francisco or LA look like, maybe it will impress upon them what has happened. But I want to get your sense of what you think the implications are for who you think the winners and losers are. That post-pandemic American society with this group of winners and this much, much larger group of losers, and what that portends for America.
Sure. Great question. The first thing that's important to understand is that the effects of this are going to be intergenerational. This is going to linger for 30 years. I'm not saying we're going to have a 30-year depression, but the effects of the depression will linger for 30 years. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. It was a very prosperous time in the American economy. I did not live through the Great Depression, but my parents did, and my grandparents did. And I was raised with kind of a depression mentality, even though it was a pretty good time for the economy. We used to go out as 9-year-old kids with our wagons and collect newspapers and tin cans door to door. We weren't doing it for environmental reasons. Maybe it was good for that, but we were recycling because you could take the tin and build battleships. I mean, that didn't change until the late 60s when the baby boomers came of age. So the after effects for 30 years, that's going to be true today. And I hear Jay Powell, chairman of the Fed, say we're not going to raise interest rates till 2023. I'm like, try 2043, Jay, because that's what you're talking about. Now, it doesn't mean there's no growth in the meantime, but growth is going to be very slow. So where are the attractive sectors? Residential real estate in places that people are moving to. So they're leaving Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, Baltimore, and some other cities. Where are they going? They're going to Nashville, Miami, Phoenix, Scottsdale, Austin, and Boise, Idaho, and some other places. So there's a housing shortage. So look at, if you can find opportunities to invest in multifamily housing with good managers in those locations, that's a good idea. I recommend 10-year Treasury notes. They're safe because they're backed by the U.S. government. People say interest rates are going to go up. No, interest rates have to come down. They're low in what's called nominal terms. That's the number you see on TV. But when you subtract inflation, which is the real rate, those real rates are still high, and they have to come down a lot lower. Gold, I recommend a 10% slice, not 50%. Don't go all in, but 10% will protect you against inflation and obviously preserve wealth. So, and a slug of cash. There's so much uncertainty. The person with cash can pivot, meaning when we get a little more clarity later this year, and you see where the opportunities really are. If you've already, put your money into a private equity fund or venture capital or some other asset that's hard to get out of, well, you're stuck. But if